Hello and welcome. Today we'll be talking about some extra propaganda. Propaganda as in thoughts that are meant to inspire you to change your political views. However, rather than just relying on rhetoric, I'll be trying to use logic, reason, and good resources to persuade you to agree with my opinion. That said, here are some extra thoughts, resources, and opinions. They are based on many years of research. However, there is only space here to provide a few of the key points and resources, and this is not intended to be a thorough examination of our situation, but rather a quick summary to inspire the reader to dig deeper, challenge what is presented here, and seek the truth through their own personal investigations. We do not want people to believe us because they like what we're saying. Rather, we would want them to believe us because they understand what we're saying and they happen to agree with us. In this spirit, we present two short essays for your consideration. One is an overview of human impacts, disparity, and possible solutions to our collective challenge of environmental stewardship. The second is a pragmatic dream of a healthy future. In this video, we'll only be covering the first of these essays, and in the next video, I will share with you the solution, which hopefully you will all enjoy and appreciate and agree with. So, to begin, an overview of human impacts, disparity, and possible solutions to our collective challenge of environmental stewardship. Technology is not a moral endeavor. It's about gaining power over our environment through the practical application of knowledge. It is one of our most powerful tools as a species, although it is power with no will of its own and requires human guidance to be effective. Unfortunately, human guidance is often less than perfect, and often less than morally commendable. More than anything, it is usually based on unfortunate ignorance in the face of urgency. People acting with the best knowledge they have at the time, which is nevertheless insufficient. With this power in the hands of ignorant in need, humans have done things that they considered great at the time, but in future, with hindsight, grew to regret. We've built up great material wealth and transformed the wilderness into a tame and reliable land of agriculture and industry, though we unknowingly polluted and destroyed a lot of the biosphere which keeps us alive whilst doing it. Now we live in an age where we have already cut down more than half of the forests on the planet and are cutting down what is left faster than ever before. We have overfished, overfarmed, overmined, overhunted, and overpolluted our planet. We are beings of relatively short lifespans, born into civilizations that have wrought havoc over centuries. We are born into a machine that is already moving and doing everything it can to mold us into its newest cogs and gears. But it's also a machine that's just beginning to realize that it will be responsible for its own demise through its ignorant actions if it does not radically change. We are now truly new cogs and gears, tasked with saving this collective entity from destruction by solving our problems in new ways. This is why we need to put our minds to the task and come up with new ways of living, new ways of getting energy, food, shelter, transport, and everything else that we need. Fortunately, we stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of our collective knowledge and already have a huge head start towards inventing a survivable future. We recommend that every one of you spend some time doing research into alternative technologies and methods that are currently available, and I'm sure you'll be impressed with what your fellow humans have thought of so far. The next step is to understand just how much we need to change and what that might look like. In the industrialized world, cities are designed around cars. Roads dominate the landscape, and cars rule most of the space between buildings. On average, roads and their supporting infrastructure, car dealerships, washes, mechanic shops, gas stations, parking lots, garages, driveways, etc., take up half of the physical space of a modern city. Also, most of our cities are built in a haphazard, piece-by-piece fashion, with very little, if any, holistic design or forethought towards ecological sustainability. Now that we care about sustainability, at least it seems to be a lot more popular in the media, and there are a lot more international agreements with it, and it's just generally getting a lot more attention than it was when I was still a child. So, presuming that now we care about sustainability, we naturally want to make things better. So we change our light bulbs, drive hybrid cars, and turn down our furnaces when we leave home in the winter. Speaking from a middle-class North American perspective here. However, how many of us know if that will be enough? How many of us know what enough even is? How would you feel, for example, if you bought a brand new electric car that reduced your ecological impact in terms of the transportation portion by 30%. You may feel wonderful about that. But if you found out that the real goal was more like a 70% reduction in impact, and that no automobile-based road system can achieve that, then you need to abandon your new obsolete car in order to build a city that will allow you to survive. And that might not feel so good after spending all of your money on that car. And we'll be putting up links throughout this to support what I'm saying. I do want to point out that because I'm trying to keep this short, a lot of these links are not necessarily the best or the ultimate in explaining the points. So for example, that one is a Shades of Green report, which goes through many different green products and shows you how much of environmental saving you're actually making. So for example, a pair of shoes I just bought, they're advertised as green and ecological, but really the only thing that was more sustainable than previously is the fabric in the tongue of the shoe that they used has less of an impact than it used to have. But it doesn't mean the shoe is actually green or sustainable. And there's a lot of products that are advertised as though they're great and wonderful for the planet when they're really not that great. So that's just one link to look at it. But as with every single one of the resources that I offer you today, please do your own research as well, because this is not a comprehensive list. It's just a sample. With that out the way, I'm going to keep going through here. So, how much is enough? And what does that really mean in terms of making our civilization sustainable? According to the Global Footprint Network's recommendations for global sustainability, humans should aim to live on ecological footprints smaller than 1.7 global hectares per person. And there's a link to that as well. Now, this number comes from the biocapacity of our planet, or in other words, how much energy we get from all of our available renewable resources in a year while still leaving them able to renew themselves as fast as we use them. So for example, if you clear cut a forest, that's not very renewable. If you were to selectively log and allow the forest to regenerate at the same rate that you were taking trees, that becomes a sustainable resource. So in terms of living within biocapacity, it means not just only using things from the natural world, but using things from the natural world only at the rate at which they can replenish themselves on an annual basis. So this means that if we become sustainable, let's just clarify this number here. So currently the Earth's biocapacity is 1.7 global hectares per human being. That's why the goal is to live within that, and we'll explain this here in a bit. So this means that if we become sustainable, that's all of the energy we get each year to work with. That's the total capacity of the planet in terms of renewable resources. It also means that if we use all of it, we will not have any wilderness left. That means that every single fish is something that we're farming and using and eating. Every tree is a target for us to chop down at some point in its life cycle. Nothing will ever be left to have a natural way of life. We will consume everything, just we'll consume it at a survivable rate. So that's not necessarily a good thing though. So we should aim to use significantly less than 1.7 global hectares per person if we want to preserve the natural beauty, biodiversity, and biocapacity of our home. This is also, in my opinion, great for the survival of our species because, or for the planet, basically, because when there's stress on our environment, the more diversity, more biodiversity we have, the more likely there is that at least some life will be able to adapt and adjust to it. Whereas if the whole world was a monocrop, anything that threatened that monocrop could wipe it out completely. And that's happened a lot in history, and you can look that up for yourself as well. So if we want to look after that, we need to use less than that number. We also need to understand that that number is not static, as in it does not mean that 20 years ago that was biocapacity and 20 years from now that was biocapacity. It changes. It decreases as our population grows because we're dividing the total capacity of the Earth by every human being. More humans, less of a portion for each of us. But it also changes as we either heal or harm our environment. So for example, a rainforest generates much more biocapacity per hectare than a desert does, and we're more than capable of transforming rainforests into deserts when we're not mindful. Thus, without care, the biocapacity of our planet can be easily diminished. With care, we can improve it, and there's a transcript from a documentary I saw a while ago. I don't have a link to the actual film. Hopefully you can find it somewhere else though. But the transcript goes through everything that happens in the film. And it's about a place called Tambo Grande in Peru, and it's a court battle between the Manhattan Mining Corp from Canada and this village of Tambo Grande. And this town is really an amazing place because the people who lived there over generations planted trees at the edge of the forest into what was desert. And by slowly planting new trees right at the edge of the forest, they were able to improve the soil's ability to hold water and make it more fertile and create more shade. So they were able to grow this orchard until they were eventually able to provide for a town of 40,000 people from an orchard that used to be just a desert with nothing. I think that's incredible. Manhattan, the Canadian mining company, bought the rights to the gold that happened to be under this town and started drilling in the town before the townspeople even knew what was going on. There was a huge long legal battle, and due to protests in Canada, they eventually gave up and let the people keep their town. And that kind of decision making, where like in today's world you have to go to protest because the actual legal status says the company is okay, that happens far too often. Another quick example, on your own time, look up the water wars in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Just another example of how the way we make decisions with today's financial system is just insane and it doesn't make sense. So we will get back to that later though. Talking about global hectares. So global hectares are a very useful metric because it measures the comprehensive impact of nearly all of our activities on our environment. The rough premise is to imagine a hectare of arable, which means easily farmable, land in a good climate and consider how much energy could be captured by life in that area in a year. This energy can be thought of in terms of calories, as in terms of like all of the corn that you grow on it, all of the livestock and the energy and all of the food that could be produced, or the wood that you could burn. This energy can be thought of in calories, but is easily converted into kilojoules, or even the effect of pollution from a particular industry on the natural environment in terms of how much less life will thrive due to the pollution. So for example, if you went ahead with a gold mine and the pollution from that mine went downriver and killed everything in that river, you could look at the amount of life that is no longer there, and that would be part of the environmental impact of the gold mine. At the same time, if you went to a desert and you planted an orchard, you could say we have increased the biocapacity of the planet by this amount as well. Okay, so this allows us to use one metric to talk about the space we need to grow food, as well as the ecological impact of manufacturing a smartphone, and allows us to compare the impacts of different regions. Currently, our global ecological footprint is 2.7 global hectares per person, and that's from globalovershootday.com. Now, it may seem odd that we're able to use 1.6 times more energy, or 160% of the energy that our planet gets in a year, especially since we still have wilderness left and we're not using all of the renewable resources of our planet as of today. Now, the reason for this is that at the moment we get most of our energy from fossil fuels and nuclear power. So for the sake of the example, if we collectively agree to live within ecological footprints of 1 global hectare or less per person, so that we would still have free wilderness left on the planet, this would mean that on average, we would have to reduce our footprints by 63%, not 263, by 63. We've got to go from 2.7 to 1. So that's a huge cut down. So think about that for a moment when you go to buy another green product and look at the benefit of that green product. Does it cut your impact down by more than 63%? Because if not, it's probably not a very effective green product. And oh yeah, I got another link here from an article called "There is no such thing as a green product." That's a little bit harsh, it's a bit of a clickbaity title, but they go through many products to show you what I'm talking about here, and you'll find that the vast majority, at least, of advertised as green or sustainable products are nothing close to that. Your electric car, for example, as we were talking about before, won't achieve that reduction in terms of just the transportation impact. So forget for a minute the huge environmental impact of creating the batteries and mining the metals and doing all that to create the car. Once it's running, you've either got a regular gasoline car or you've got an electric car, and it would seem to us as though the electric car makes more sense. And unfortunately, when it makes sense is contextual. So it's not about is it electric or is it gasoline. So I'll read this here because I think I explained it here as well. Yeah, so it is here. So your electric car still needs power. And the minimum energy it takes to move an object over a distance is determined by the distance and the mass. So like if you're trying to take a kilogram weight and carry it up a hill, it's going to take a certain amount of energy to lift it all there that way, whether you're using an electric motor or a horse or a car or walking there yourself. It just takes that much energy to exert that much force over that distance. In terms of real energy, we also have to factor friction and acceleration, which is also turning your car. And so if your car weighs the same and the roads are the same, then the energy is essentially the same. Now with an electric car, you do get a benefit. It is slightly more efficient in terms of your electric motor doesn't create as much heat as an internal combustion engine when it's burning. Also, the electric motor is not spewing out some unburnt gasoline, which is why we have catalytic converters in our cars to help clean that up. So essentially, your gasoline engine is not 100% efficient. You can improve the efficiency though with like superchargers, blowers, better exhaust systems, better regulation of the air-fuel mixture and all this kind of stuff. But you're still going to have some loss to heat, whereas in the electric motor, there will be some loss to heat, it's just not that same degree. It doesn't literally have a fire in it, right? Now when it comes to braking, on your gasoline car, you use friction, which is also generating heat to slow down your car, and that's wasted energy. If you have an intelligently designed electric car, you can use your motor as a generator so that to slow yourself down, you create energy for the car, you recharge your battery. And that's done even on electric bicycles these days. That's not crazy technology, it's just sensible technology. You can make an electric car that doesn't do that though. That's why I gotta clarify, it has to make sense. So with that in mind, your electric car can be more efficient with the amount of energy it's got than your gasoline car. But that can be is very important, and what that website I just showed you before will help explain is that if you have the power for your electric car coming from a coal power plant that does not run very efficiently versus you have a gasoline car with a very efficient engine, the gasoline car can actually be more efficient overall than the electric car. Because remember, even though the electric car is efficient at the end usage, the coal power plant may not be that efficient to create the energy it's using in the first place. So let's get back in here. Now, I dare say, you might begin to suspect that the solution proposed to us, which is that free conscious consumers like you and I, we can purchase green products to save the world by making it better every day. This is actually sinister, in my opinion, because not only does it ignore an actual goal, they never tell you this is what we have to get to, okay? They also don't neglect what that means in terms of your impact reduction. So if they say, hey, this is 10% better than last year, wonderful, buy it, give me your money. Is 10% good enough? What if it's not and we fail anyway, right? That's what I'm getting to. So not only does it neglect all of that, it doesn't give us a clear goal, it doesn't help us understand what we're really doing and how far we're getting along, but it also allows all of us to procrastinate whilst continuing to provide profit for corporations for as long as possible. Because if you keep buying the green product thinking you're doing good without doing enough, they keep making money even though you're not becoming sustainable. So not only is all that going on, but the worst part, which really gets to me, is that the blame for all of this is put on you and me. It's put on the average working class person. And what I mean by that is we live in a democracy, so if we don't like what our government's doing, it's up to you and me to vote to change it. And we live in a free market, which means if we don't like what corporations are doing, it's up to you and me to change it. If I don't want to see cars on the road anymore, I must not buy a car. There is, as some of you are starting to guess, a bit of an illusion there because we don't have as much freedom of choice as we would like, and the products that I would like to see on the market simply don't exist on the market. So, for example, well, we'll get there in a second, but to change the road system in a city to something that's more sensible, you cannot do that as a free consumer. You can only do that as a large government entity who's going to rezone everything and change the norms. So for us as individuals to make those changes when we cannot spend our money on it, we don't have those options, and in my experience, our voting ability is not significant enough to direct the course of our government. Like saying if I want this party or that party does not say, do I want to change the way the roads are doing? Even when they may run on a platform that says they'll do that, how often do politicians ever follow through on what they promise to do in their platforms? So I feel like there's something missing from all of this, but I'm digressing. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, with all of that said, and as complicated as that is, and as unfortunate as all of that is, the truth is actually more complicated, and that makes things a whole lot worse. Okay, so let's get into this part now. Disparity is the next layer of detail to unravel. There are many measures of disparity in the world, but two of the most comprehensive are ecological footprints, which we've just talked about, and the Human Development Index. One expresses our impact on the planet per person. The other is a score that reflects our socio-economic well-being based on factors like healthcare, clean water, literacy, gender equality, income, etc. For the most part, the country's higher HDI, the higher a country's HDI, the higher its ecological footprint. And we got a link on there from the United Nations Human Development Reports. Now, since most of the world lives with low HDIs, let me unpack this first before we go on here. So what we're talking about is if you live in a place like Calgary, your ecological footprint is around 10 global hectares per person, which is a huge impact. At the same time, your Human Development Index is pretty darn high. You're in a pretty safe, pretty affluent place. You're in a pretty equal place. There's not a lot of stress on your life there's no natural disasters, no terrorism. We have clean water. We have decent healthcare. So it's a pretty good place to live, and people feel happy there. Now the challenge is, so let's move on now, that most of the world lives with a low HDI. So for example, if you live in a rural area in Ethiopia, you might not have as high of a material quality of life as if you live in New York. If you live in Bangladesh, you may not have as much space around you, and you might not have a nice garden in your backyard, or you might not have a backyard. So when we look at the majority of humanity, the HDI index is pretty low for most of us. But that also means that if the majority of humanity started to live the way that people in countries with a high HDI. So for example, if everyone lived the way that people in London live, then we're going to need 2.6 planets to support our consumption by 2050. And when I'm looking at the stat, the reason I'm hesitating is because for some places in wealthier countries, basically, that number is actually worse than that, and we'll get into that later. Basically, if everyone lived the way that people in Calgary lived, we need 5 planets. Whereas if everyone lived the way the average person in the Western world or in the more affluent world lives, it would be 2.6 planets. And there's another link here, which was from the United Nations Sustainable Development section, and talking about humanity's growing ecological footprint. So there's a lot of worry that right now we are already consuming too much on the planet, we're damaging the planet, we're not doing well, and yet it's a very small portion of humanity which is having this huge impact. So what if the rest of humanity had a huge impact too? And that's what we're talking about here. So whilst this may make us naturally weary of developing countries as potential culprits for destroying our planet in future, this fear not only redirects us from the truth that at present, developing countries actually have a very small impact on our environment and are not at all responsible for the majority of our accumulated pollution since the Industrial Revolution. But more importantly, it presumes that the only way for people to improve their societies is by following in the footsteps of those that have already become very highly developed. You also notice me hesitating every time I say highly developed or richer or Western or this or that. The terminology when I was in school changed almost every year, and as soon as it seemed like, oh, this is a biased term, oh, it's a bad term, now we shouldn't use it, they'd invent a new term which is still referring to the biased situation, nothing's changed, but it seemed more politically correct. But it's just kind of confusing. The fact is the truth's not pretty, and no matter what you call it, it's referring to something that needs to change. Anyway, so we're presuming that people who have low industrialization in their country are going to become like us is absurd. Because you just have to look at some of the African nations that have adopted cell phones without ever building landline networks, not to mention telegraphs or using carrier pigeons. So you can see that this premise is simply untrue. People do not have to first build the coal power plant before they can build the nuclear power plant. that you can have access to technology that is far more advanced and skip over the whole Industrial Revolution. We don't have to have child laborers in sweatshop factories. We do have that in the world now in a lot of developing countries, but we don't have to. That could have been skipped over, and it can be skipped over. So yeah, this notion of fear is just, I don't think it's justified. And here is a link to show about the cell phones in Africa. So you can see that a village that never bothered to have a rotary phone, you immediately catch up with the high technology. You don't have to go through that whole process. Now, the very obvious truth is that we can not only all learn from our collective knowledge to move forward better than our ancestors, but we're also always inventing new technologies and methods that enable us to make better futures. Therefore, we think it's prudent to focus on the very real and unsustainable problem of industrialized civilization today that we know will destroy our biosphere without action taken to change it, rather than focus on the fear of the possibility that other countries might become as bad as the worst ones. Yeah, so basically in places like Calgary, there's a lot of talk of who cares what we're doing? China's the problem, India's the problem. Not that they are the problem, they will become the problem. And so we should worry more about what they're going to do than what we are doing. And I think that's absurd, because we know that what we are doing is so gross that if the rest of the world did live like us, we would all be dead. So we need to change and set a better example. We shouldn't just say, don't let anyone else improve their situation. Now, right, down the rabbit hole we go, and it gets worse. So to put some detail into our picture of disparity, in 2011, according to the Global Footprint Network, Bangladesh, which is the home to Dhaka, which is a city of over 10 million people, they had an average ecological footprint of only 0.73 global hectares per person. Whilst in Canada, our global average footprint was 8.6 global hectares per person. In Calgary, where I went to university, it was closer to 10. It was 9.86. And there's the Footprint Network, where you can look up different countries. This allows you to check data for, say, Canada versus France or England, or whatever you want to see, whatever you're curious about. You can look up the data from this network. It's pretty interesting to see the disparity in the world that way. Now, what does this mean? This means that people living in Bangladesh can actually consume more energy and still have a sustainable impact on our biosphere. Whereas people in Canada are so harmful to our environment that if everyone in the world lived like we did, we would need more than 5 Earths to sustain us. When we understand this picture, we see that in general, the global poor are not nearly as responsible for our problem as the global rich. And even more appalling than this inequality in blame is unfortunately the inequality in effect. So, according to the United Nations Human Development Report, such as the 2007/2008 report, Fighting Climate Change, Human Solidarity in a Divided World, and there's a link to that one as well, and other more recent UNHCR reports, there's a lot of United Nations reports. A lot of them are very informative, well worth reading. In general, the HDR reports cover like a quick update of what the world is doing, and then they also each have a specific focus. So that one I pulled out was focused on climate change, though not everyone has just that specific focus. So it is clear that people who will suffer the most from the effects of adverse climate change are those who live in areas with low HDIs. Thus, speaking generally, the people who are not only responsible for our problem, and the people who have the power to make the most difference in solving our problem, are also the people who have the least natural impetus to do anything about it. Indeed, for people living in places like Calgary, who suffer almost no natural disasters and whose biggest complaint is the winter cold, aside from less access to fresh water due to the glaciers of our headwaters melting away to nothing, and there's a link about that. The Bow River's headwaters are going to get down to about 50% of what we're used to, so there'll be water rationings, but no water. Also, there's increased intensity and prevalence of wildfires, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that for now, but there's a link that was kind of predicting it before we had the Big Mac fires and all of BC burning and Australia burning and all that other stuff. It might seem like we have a lot less to lose from a warming climate and could stand to gain longer growing seasons and more temperate winters. So in this context, we may have, speaking of Calgarians, that's where I was living when I wrote this, though we may have to ration our drinking water and make a lot more fire breaks, it is likely that most people living here would actually enjoy a warmer climate. Now, this is a delusion, and it's a tempting delusion, and I see a lot of people buying into it who do live in places like that where, so what if it gets a degree warmer, it's just going to be nicer. And because of this delusion, it is essential for everyone to understand our biosphere better. It's a really complicated thing, but it can be studied, and many of us have already spent many years learning to understand it, recording that information, and sharing it with others. Almost everything I've learned was from other people learning it for me. I've learned very little new knowledge myself that wasn't already found by others and shared by them. So, something as simple as carbon dioxide, which is only one of many greenhouse gases, and arguably it's not the most important one. Water vapor is the most important one because that's the main one, and there's a lot of water. So as the planet warms up, ice melts, liquid water evaporates. Liquid water is a greenhouse gas. The more more water vapor in the air, the warmer the planet gets. The warmer it gets, the more the ice melts, the more evaporates. The warmer it gets, the more the melting, the more the evaporating, the warmer it gets. This is called a feedback loop, and it's not as simple as I just said. The part I just said is simple and straightforward. That happens, but there's also the fact that water vapor makes clouds. Clouds reflect heat. Also, the changing color of dirt and soil changes the amount of heat. So on the one hand, the more clouds could reflect away the heat, but turning a desert into a rainforest will actually absorb more heat because sand reflects more light than trees. So it's a very, very complicated process. Even the thermohaline circulation of the planet, how the warm waters and cold waters of the oceans move and exchange salt and nutrients and all that stuff, that's affected by temperature as well, which further affects temperature. So we can see that it's a scary thing as we get warmer, but trying to predict exactly what will happen and how is extremely difficult. We know something's going to happen, and we know generally where it's going, but to tell you if you're going to have a rainstorm on this city or like a drought on that city, that's a kind of impossible for now. Anyway, let's get in here. Okay, so we're talking about greenhouse gases, their effects, and how we may not be aware of the full effects. So, for example, carbon dioxide. We're worried about it because it's going to warm up our atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas. But we may not be thinking about it in terms of what it does to our oceans. So, carbon dioxide dissolves in water to make carbonic acid. And thus, the more carbon dioxide we release, the more acidic our oceans get. And here's from, another link to a government website which talks about what ocean acidification is. So we got that there. Now this can be very serious because some of the species of shellfish living in these conditions are unable to make their shells when the water's too acidic. This threatens the base of the ocean's food web. Not all of it, but a lot of the small critters that begin at the bottom of the food web in the ocean are shellfish, and they will suffer by a more acidic ocean. And if you lose that, like for example blue whales, they eat tiny little things, and a lot of the bigger fish eat smaller fish which eat these tiny little things. So it's very important to keep that healthy. And furthermore, warming ocean temperatures also cause coral bleaching. That's already devastated 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef, and it's basically a nursery for a lot of ocean species. And here's a link about the ocean bleaching, as well as a link to what this means for species by losing the coral. They're losing the nursery for the baby fish to grow in. Thus, though many people think about climate change in terms of warmer temperature and bigger storms, the real consequences are far more complex and far-reaching than most of us realize. Like another myth is that people believe that trees give us oxygen to breathe. Trees do make oxygen. People forget that trees breathe in oxygen as well, and they breathe out carbon dioxide. So when there's sunlight, they make oxygen, but when there's no sunlight, they suck up oxygen. So on an average day, the tree makes about as much oxygen as it sucks back up, and it doesn't really give us anything to breathe. Now, what does is phytoplankton. So most of our oxygen comes from the oceans. And phytoplankton are tiny little ocean plants, and they'll often make oxygen during the daytime, but then die before they have a chance to suck up that oxygen again. So, on that note, the bit of a tangent here, but the Amazon is thought of as lungs of the earth. It's not really making us oxygen, but the Amazon River has a lot of nutrients that feed into the ocean, which fuels the growth of phytoplankton, which in turn gives us oxygen. So indirectly, yes, the Amazon does help us with oxygen, and if we destroyed the Amazon rainforest, we might have a bit of a problem with that. Anyway, the point being, if we destroy our oceans through too much warming or too much acidification, and we hurt the life of the smallest creatures on our planet, we're basically going to lose our lives regardless of where on the land you live, or how much money you have in the bank, or how fast your car is. And this is how oceans add oxygen to the world here. So this means if you're in Calgary, sure, you may think, oh, it's just going to get a little bit warmer this year, no big deal. But if it goes too far, you're going to be out of breath and you'll suffocate. So now that we all understand that we are in this together, and that we all suffer the consequences of failure, it's time to look once more at what we can do to change things. So let's look at an example at the city scale and try to work through a specific example. Now, I did most of this work in Calgary, so we're going to use that as our example. And they have a 100-year sustainability plan, which you can check out here. And unfortunately, this plan has no explanation of sustainability in it. And its only goal is to do better than yesterday. Now, this offensively insufficient publication is unfortunately apparently the official stance that the Government of Canada has decided to take on the issue. We believe that this is because they realized that even in 100 years, it would be impossible to make Calgary sustainable. And thus, rather than tell the citizens the bleak truth, they've decided to withhold the truth, and instead simply insinuate that as long as we all do a little bit better, then everything will be just fine. Now, the reason we believe this is based on our knowledge of ecological footprints. The goal for Calgary, which had a footprint of around 10 global hectares per human being in 2011, is an 85 to 90% energy reduction. And it's not hard to see that with the technologies we have available for making things better, such as electric cars, low energy appliances, better uses of recycling and composting centers, they're all going to fall so far short of sufficient that the goal of retrofitting Calgary to become sustainable is literally impossible. Now, at that point, the government should have told us all what was going on, because there are ways that we could build a new city from scratch that would be sustainable and desirable, and that's what we should be working towards. However, to tell us that would in some ways be a treasonous call to revolution, and it's understandable why any government might not choose to take that stance. And we're going to revisit that claim in a moment, but I want to unpack this here. I was in university when this Calgary Sustainability Plan was created, and the people who made it came to talk to us. I challenged them on their plan because it does not define sustainability or give a goal or have a target or show us how we're going to get there. And when I said, hey, what about these United Nations reports? What about these numbers? What about our footprint? Shouldn't this be the goal? They acknowledged that I was right, as in the United Nations was right, and that the reason they made their plan was because of that information. And the reason that that information is not in their plan, and they did not tell the citizens of Calgary about it, is because they realized they would fail. They realized that even in 100 years, you cannot change things enough to make it really sustainable. However, if you design something from scratch that's designed to be sustainable, it works. So that was an interesting moment in my life, going through that and talking with them. But now, if retrofitting a modern city will not make it sustainable, then how do we become sustainable? So it turns out we've had the answer for decades. Well, we've actually had the answer for thousands of years, but I'm talking about a modern city answer. So to be quick and clarifying, there are tribes and villages all over the world that are sustainable. The entire country of Bhutan has a negative carbon emission, so they're actually cleaning up the world more than anything. So it's possible to do it, but Bhutan doesn't have like a space program, right? They're not the world's leader in cell phone technology. So in terms of modern advanced cities, none of those are sustainable. And we'll get there in a sec. But for that modern, desirable, high-tech city, could they be sustainable? And that's the yes. So One person who shared some of these ideas is Jacques Fresco, whose holistically designed cities were presented in Future by Design, as well as to the American public on Larry King Live in 1974. They showcase many new ways to organize a city in an efficient and desirable way. These city concepts take advantage of the best knowledge we have in every aspect of a city's design, from micro waste management systems and aquaponic gardens to passive geothermal heating. And there's links to both the interview as well as the Future by Design website, so you can please go look and see more there. It's a really wonderful project. Now, with regards to transport infrastructure, these kinds of cities usually focus on personal rapid transit systems, which vary in form but include things like a spiderweb of light monorail tracks, which are raised high enough to avoid all pedestrian and animal traffic. The pods that run on these tracks would also be equipped with touchscreen maps so that the user can go where they want to via the fastest route, and when they arrive, the pod is free for anyone else to use. It's not only safe and efficient, but it allows for a city to be literally half the size with the same population and amenities, whilst preventing drunk driving accidents and the need for traffic intersections and pedestrian crossings. All in all, this style of holistic, ecologically minded, high-tech design should be able to deliver a much higher quality of life compared to traditional cities, and can do so within ecologically sustainable footprints. And there's a lot there, but please do watch the movies and interviews and documentaries, and you'll see what I mean. And I do want to clarify that this isn't saying this is the exact way to build a city. It's saying this is the method of how you would build a city. Each city will look different depending on the environment, the number of people, the intended purpose of the city. Maybe one is focused on marine biology studies. Maybe one's focused more on a mining industry thing. So they're all going to be a little bit different, and it's not to say what is the perfect way to build a city. It's to say the best method to go about designing a city. And that method is essentially do it holistically with everything in mind, and especially with the environmental impact in mind. And when you consider the average city today, that's just not done. Like our environmental consideration is essentially, let's make sure we have a park here and there to make it more aesthetically pleasing, but we're not really ensuring that the ecosystems that were in those areas are still being maintained and looked after as well as we could. So, in other words, we do know how to make sustainable and more desirable futures for ourselves. So why have we not been seriously talking about these solutions in the at this point it was 44, it's now 46 years since 1974, since they were first publicly presented? To be clear, there have been a handful of efforts towards constructing new eco-cities. However, the idea as a necessary step for everyone living in modern cities as we work towards becoming sustainable is certainly not something that has been widely considered by most of the world, at least not yet. Now, and let's just consider that for a moment. If we're saying that in the last almost 50 years, we've known how to create a sustainable life, and we've known we need to, isn't it weird that we're not talking about it? Isn't it weird that the Jacques Fresco's interview in 1974 is the last time I saw someone on TV talking about this? Why isn't this more popular? And this ties in with that Calgary 100-year sustainability plan. They knew all of this too. They knew it was their job to study that stuff. They know what I'm talking about. Nothing I said surprised them. But they're not talking about the solution. They're not talking about what we need to do. They're not admitting what we know. So where is this? And we believe that the answer to the absence of the solution in our collective mind is that the nature of our resource management systems, as regulated through our debt-based global financial system, ensures that the kind of infrastructural change where we would all abandon our obsolete infrastructure and build brand new cities is impossible. It's not physically impossible, it's financially impossible. If everyone in a city put up their house for sale along with all of their cars and obsolete assets simultaneously, no one would want to buy it because no one wants to live in a dying city that's obsolete. Everyone wants the new one. And since everyone wants to move out and no one wants to buy it, all of your assets would become worthless. Now, at that point, you cannot get a loan from a bank to buy into a new, highly desirable home in a yet-to-be-built eco-city. Because even if the banker was your friend, if you cannot provide at least a 10% down payment, then they cannot use their fractional reserve superpowers to fabricate the rest of the money out of thin air to help you. There's another link to understanding fractional reserve banking. And I don't think I went into it here. No? Okay. So just to clarify that more, in Calgary, about 5 or 6 years ago, the average person had $330,000 in assets while simultaneously $30,000 in debt. As in, you've got debt on your credit card, but you own a home and you own a car as collateral, as an asset. But if your assets become liquidated because no one wants to buy them, you can't sell them, they're worth nothing, then you're left with that debt. And when you go to put a down payment on a home and you have negative monies and you can't put up an asset to back it up, you're not going to get your loan to buy into the new home. Also, the more we want to survive and the more we decide that we need these new kinds of cities and we want them, that makes them more expensive simply because we want them. So, in the game that we are all playing in the real world, only the wealthiest of people and the lucky few who are the first to move before the masses catch on will ever be able to afford the transition into sustainable, high-tech eco-cities. Indeed, even those with the financial clout of the Chinese government still struggle to pull off the feat, as we learn from the challenges of Dongtan, which was intended to be the world's greatest example of a modern eco-city, but has run into bureaucratic and financial issues which have severely slowed its development. Details on what is happening there are scarce, because some reports insist that construction never began, whilst others describe the success of the city and how its inhabitants are living there happily. Now, despite this confusion, it's clear that China is trying to build new eco-cities, and most of the reports are showing that getting them built and making sure that they actually meet their goals of being an eco-city has not been easy, not even for this relatively powerful and unified government. So here we have a link that says China is building 285 new eco-cities, which is amazing until you realize they've defined eco-city as not as bad as Beijing, which makes almost anything you build an eco-city. We also have from China Dialogue Why Eco-Cities Fail, which was talking about how Dongtan never got built and doesn't exist. But we also have one from Inspiraction News, which is showing us how Dongtan does exist, and it produced 100% renewable energy for 1 week. So I have no idea what's going on there, and I did try looking, and the more I looked, the more I found very conflicting information. So maybe Dongtan exists, maybe it doesn't. I would think that if it does exist and is doing well, it would be a little easier to find information on that. I think it would be being advertised a bit more. At any rate, though, it was a great idea, and I hope it does work, and I hope it does continue. But it shows us that it's hard to do. And I don't think that there is anywhere in the world right now a modern high-tech eco-city that fits the ecological footprints we're aiming for. That said, there are villages and towns and countries that are doing great. It's just not in the modern high-tech format. And I clarify that here. Of course, high-tech is not the only way to be sustainable. There are many traditional and more modern ways for people to live in balance with nature. However, high-tech eco-cities are the only way to have millions of people living in close proximity, both sustainably and with a high quality of life. So for example, in Dhaka, there are millions of people living together in close proximity, and they are sustainable, but they don't have a very high quality of life. So it's also unlikely that humans will be able to continue advanced research or travel to other planets unless we live in modern high-tech eco-cities that allow us to progress in this way. And in the really long run, that's essential to the survival of our species. So, if we know how to do it, and the only reason we cannot do it is because of a faith-based intellectual game that we all agreed to play, or were brought up into, coerced into, and taught to believe to play, then perhaps it's time for us to invent a new game where the rules allow us not only to survive, but to thrive. And that is the topic for our next video, which is a dream of a healthy future. Thank you all for watching. I hope you feel a little bit more informed about how the world works and where we need to go and how we can try to get there. And do please check out all the links. And I also encourage you to do more research on anything you feel like I didn't do the best job of clarifying. I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.